Eleanor Bennett pressed her bleeding hand against her mouth to keep from crying out because the men hunting her were close enough to hear her breathe. She had lost her father, her land, and every person she had ever trusted, all in the span of 30 days. And now, deep in the Rocky Mountains, with nothing but a hidden document and a prayer. She pushed open a cabin door she prayed was empty. It wasn't. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and don't you dare leave before the ending. Eleanor Bennett had rehearsed exactly what she would say if she ever found herself standing at the edge of a stranger's property, with blood drying on her arm and 3 men combing the valley below. She had planned to be calm, reasonable, convincing. She had not planned to find anyone home. The cabin sat against the mountain's face like it had grown there. Timber dark, low-roofed smoke rising from a chimney that told her somebody was alive inside. She stood at the door for 1 breath, maybe 2. Behind her, the last light of a summer afternoon was folding itself behind the peaks, and somewhere below, she had heard horses. Not wild ones. She knocked. Nothing. She lifted the latch. The rifle was already up when the door swung open. She saw the barrel first, then the hands holding it, large, steady, unhurried hands that told her this man had pointed a gun at things before and never flinched while doing it. Then she saw his face, half in shadow. Jaw, set like stone eyes, dark and reading her, the way a man reads weather on a mountain he knows better than his own name. "Step away from that door," he said. His voice was low, not loud. Men who were truly dangerous never needed to be loud. Eleanor did not step back. Her legs had stopped taking reliable instructions sometime around midday, when she'd slid down a riverbank and torn open her arm on a branch. She gripped the doorframe instead and looked at the rifle, and then looked at the man behind it. "I'm not armed," she said, "and I'm not a threat to you. You're bleeding on my floor." She looked down. She was. A slow drip from the cut on her forearm had found the gap in her sleeve and was leaving a dark spot on the wood planks below. "I apologize for that," she said. And then, because she had been awake for 2 days, and her body had apparently reached some outer limit, she hadn't been informed of her knees went wrong. She didn't fall hard. She caught herself on the doorframe, one hand gripping the timber, and she stood back up in the same breath. But he had seen it. She could tell by the way his jaw moved some small shift in the muscle there, and then the rifle came down. Not all the way. He didn't lower it to his side. He held it at half-height barrel toward the floor, still watching her. "You've got about 5 minutes before you drop," he said. "I won't drop." "You already nearly did." She straightened her spine. "That was a stumble. It's different." He stared at her for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. Then he stepped aside and tilted his head toward the interior of the cabin. Not welcoming, just making room. "Get inside before somebody below sees that door open," he said. Nathan Cole Walker had lived alone on this mountain for 9 years, 4 months, and some number of days he had stopped counting about 3 years in. He knew the sound of every animal on the ridge. He knew which storms came from the northwest and which ones came fast from the south without warning. He knew where the spring ran clean and where it didn't. He knew the mountain the way you only know something you have given your whole self to, not because you loved it perfectly, but because it was the only thing left that hadn't cost you more than it gave. He had not spoken to another human being in going on 6 weeks. The last had been a trapper who'd passed through looking for the lower trail, and that conversation had lasted roughly the length of time it took to point south and say, "That way." He had not had a woman inside this cabin in 9 years. He stood by the fireplace now and watched her sit down on the bench by the wall, without being invited to, and pull back her sleeve to look at the cut on her arm. It was not shallow. It needed cleaning, and it needed something wrapped around it, and she was doing neither of those things. She was just looking at it the way people look at a problem they can't quite afford to deal with yet. "That needs cleaning," he said. "I'm aware." She pressed the sleeve back down. "I've got carbolic and cloth. I'm not here to be a burden on you." He crossed to the shelf on the far wall and took down the carbolic and a strip of clean linen he kept there for himself, because mountain work had a way of finding your skin, and he had learned years ago to keep what he needed close. He brought both across and set them on the bench beside her without a word. She looked at them. Then she looked at him. "You're not going to tell me to leave," she said. "I didn't say that. You haven't said much of anything." "I've said enough." He pulled the chair from the table and sat down, forearms on his knees, still watching her. "Who are the men in the valley?" Her hand stopped moving on the linen strip. "What men?" "The ones with 2 horses and a lantern on the south trail." He let that sit there. "I spotted them about an hour before you knocked. They were moving slow, like they were looking for something. Then you showed up bleeding at my door." He tilted his head slightly. "You want to try a different answer?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She had a way of going still when she was thinking, not the stillness of someone frightened, but the stillness of someone deciding how much to reveal and to whom. He recognized it because it was the same thing he did. "They work for a man named Caldwell," she said finally. "Gerald Caldwell. He owns the Continental Land and Settlement Company out of Denver." Nathan kept his face neutral. "What do they want from you?" She reached into the collar of her dress, a practical, unhurried movement, and pulled out a leather envelope flattened and sweat-damp from being carried against her body. She held it up briefly and then set it on the bench beside the carbolic. "This," she said. "Or rather, what's inside it?" "What's inside it?" Proof that Gerald Caldwell and 2 territorial judges signed fraudulent land patents on nearly 400 acres of settled homestead land. Proof that at least 11 families lost their properties based on documents that were fabricated. She looked at him directly. "Proof that my father was one of them. And proof that when he tried to bring it to the law, they arranged for him to be found dead at the bottom of a creek and called it an accident. The fire popped. Outside, a night bird called once and went quiet." "How did you get it?" Nathan asked. "My father hid it. Before they came for him, he sent me a letter." She pulled the sleeve of her dress back down over the linen she'd wrapped. "By the time I reached our land, they had already filed papers claiming ownership. Our foreman was gone. Our horses were gone. They had a man with a badge standing in the doorway of our own house." Her voice was steady. It was the steadiness of someone who had already cried everything that was in them and was now just left with the facts. "I got the envelope from where he'd hidden it, and I ran. How long have you been running?" 12 days. Nathan looked at the envelope on the bench. He looked at the woman who had carried it 12 days on foot through summer mountain country with men behind her and a cut on her arm she hadn't complained about once. He looked at the window, though he couldn't see anything through it in the dark. "You can sleep on the bench tonight," he said. "We'll talk about the rest in the morning." Her name was Eleanor Grace Bennett, and she was 27 years old, and she had been many things in her life. A rancher's daughter, a schoolgirl, a young woman who'd been told she was too sharp-tongued for her own good by every person who found her inconvenient. She had been a helper on her father's property since she was old enough to hold a fence post, and she had been for 6 weeks before everything collapsed. A woman with a plan. The plan had been simple. Her father, Thomas Bennett, had been gathering evidence against Caldwell's company for the better part of a year. He had contacts in Denver. He had a lawyer he trusted. He had the documents. Eleanor had known only the outline he hadn't wanted her involved in, case it went wrong. It went wrong. She lay on the bench in Nathan Walker's cabin, with her arm wrapped in clean linen and her leather envelope pressed beneath her as a pillow of sorts, and she stared at the low ceiling and listened to the mountain breathe. She could hear him in the other room. Occasional movement, the shift of a man who slept lightly, if he slept at all, and she tried to decide whether she had made a terrible mistake or a survivable one. She knew almost nothing about him. She knew he had a rifle and had pointed it at her and then put it down. She knew he had given her carbolic and linen without being asked. She knew he had a shelf organized with the particular neatness of someone who had long since stopped having anything he didn't need, which meant he had long since stopped having people. She knew his name because she had asked it, and he had told her, Nathan Walker, the way people tell you their name when they don't think it should mean much. She wondered what it had meant once. She fell asleep with the envelope under her head and one hand on the linen at her arm. In the morning he was already outside when she woke. She could hear him, the rhythmic clang of something metal, a hammer against post or iron, the sounds of a man who started working before the light was full, because that was what mountain days required. She folded the blanket he had left across her at some point in the night. She hadn't heard him do it, and she went to the door. Howe was at the fence line 20 yards out, resetting a post that had leaned in the night's wind. He didn't look up when she opened the door. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. She went back inside and poured 2 cups and carried them both out. She held one toward him without speaking. He looked at it. Then he took it, and she stood by the fence post while he worked, and they drank in silence for a while. "The men on the South Trail," he said eventually. "They'll loop back in daylight. They had a lantern last night, which means they're not giving up when it gets dark. That's professional." He drove the post with one more stroke. "How many men does Caldwell have?" "In Denver, I don't know. Working this search." She had seen 3, but she thought there might be more. "At least 3 that I counted." "Any chance they don't know you came up the mountain? I crossed the creek twice trying to break the trail, but—" She paused. "One of them is a tracker. He was the one who found me at the Garvey Ranch 2 days ago. I was there less than an hour. He still found me." Nathan looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Garvey's ranch is 20 miles south of here." "Yes." "You walked 20 miles in 2 days with that arm." "I didn't have a horse." He said nothing to that. He set the cup down on the fence rail and looked out at the valley below where the summer morning was just starting to show itself in thin gold across the grass. "You should know something," Eleanor said. "I didn't come to this mountain by accident. I heard there was an abandoned cabin up here. I wasn't planning on finding you. I was planning on finding somewhere to hide long enough to make a decision about where to take the documents." "What decision?" "There's a federal judge in Laramie. A woman I know, she worked with my father before he died. She says he's honest. She thinks he might hear the case." Eleanor looked at the envelope she'd brought outside with her tucked under her arm. "But Laramie is 2 days' ride from here, and I don't have a horse, and if Caldwell's men find me before I get there—" "They'll take the envelope and nobody will ever see it again," Nathan said. "Yes." He picked up the hammer again. He drove the post 3 more times clean and hard, and then he straightened up and looked at her. "Where'd your father find those documents?" He had contacts inside Caldwell's operation. A land surveyor who grew a conscience. The surveyor copied everything before he left: survey maps, signed orders, correspondence between Caldwell and the judges. It's all in there. She tapped the envelope. "The surveyor disappeared 3 months ago. We don't know what happened to him." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Caldwell's Land Company," he said. "They've been operating in Colorado long." "About 6 years. Why?" He turned and walked back toward the cabin. "Come inside," he said. "There's something I want to show you." I went to the far wall behind the stove in a gap between the timber and the rough shelving he'd built and pulled out a wooden box that had been sitting there so long it had gathered a ridge of dust along one edge. He set it on the table and opened the lid. Inside were papers. Eleanor reached for them and then stopped herself. "May I?" she said. "That's why I brought it out." She lifted the first sheet. It was a survey map, hand-drawn, detailed, dated 1877. She recognized the style immediately. It matched the ones in her own envelope. She looked up at him. "Where did you get this?" "My brother." Nathan sat down across from her. His voice did not change. It was the same low, flat voice he'd used since she'd arrived, and she was starting to understand that this was not coldness. This was what happened to a man who had learned that showing pain only gave the wrong people something to aim at. His name was Daniel. He had 40 acres in the lower valley east of here, about 15 miles. Good land. He'd worked it for 4 years. What happened? Continental Land and Settlement Company happened. He looked at the map in her hands. They filed papers saying his deed was invalid. Said the original grant had lapsed. He fought it. He went to the county recorder, went to the sheriff, wrote letters to Denver. A pause. Nobody helped him. They gave him 90 days to vacate. He didn't have anywhere to go. Nathan's hands were flat on the table. He was dead by the end of the 60 days. They said it was a fall. Eleanor set the map down slowly. When was this? 10 years ago. She looked at him. He was looking at the map, not at her. She said Nathan. He looked up. The same company, she said. The same judges, the same surveyor's marks on those documents. She opened her envelope and laid 2 sheets beside his. The notations matched, same abbreviations, same format, same seal pressed into the lower corner. It's the same operation. They've been doing this for 10 years. Something moved in his face. Not much. Just a tightening around the eyes, the kind that came before a man decided something. The federal judge in Laramie, he said. Yes. You said 2 days' ride. From here, yes. I've got 2 horses. Eleanor looked at him carefully. You'd come with me. I'd escort you to Laramie. He said it the way he said most things, like the decision had been made somewhere quiet inside him before he ever spoke it aloud, and the speaking was just formality. I'm not going to watch Caldwell's men run you down on an open road with documents that could put him in a federal prison. You don't know me, she said. You've known me for less than 12 hours. I knew my brother for 26 years. He stood. That's enough. The tracker found the cabin mid-morning. Eleanor heard him first, or rather she heard Nathan hear him, which was its own kind of warning. She had been outside helping him water the horses, trying to be useful in a way that didn't require instruction, when Nathan went very still. His hands stopped on the water bucket. His head turned slightly toward the southeast. Inside, he said quietly. Take the envelope. Stay away from the window. What is it? Inside, Miss Bennett. Not harsh, just certain. She went. She stood just inside the door in the shadow away from the window and listened. A horse on the southern path. One horse moving slow. Then it stopped. A voice called out from below the tree line. Hello, the cabin. Nathan did not answer immediately. She heard him move unhurried, deliberate, and then heard the creak of the fence gate as he walked to the edge of his property line. Help you, he called. Hoping so, friend. The voice was pleasant. The kind of pleasant that had been practiced. I'm looking for a woman, young dark hair, traveling alone. She would have come through this country in the last day or 2. You seen anyone like that? What's your business with her? A pause. She's my employer's niece. Left home in a bad state after her father passed. Family's worried about her. Your employer sent a tracker, did he? Another pause. Shorter. I've got some skill reading trail, yes. That's a fine story, Nathan said. His voice had not changed. I haven't seen any woman up here. This mountain doesn't get much foot traffic. Usually means people have business staying lost. Silence from the tree line. I meant no offense, the voice said. You understand? None taken. You'll want the lower trail if you're heading north. Faster going. She heard the horse shift. She heard the man's weight settle the small sounds of a decision being made. Much obliged, the voice said finally. The horse moved away. South first, then angling toward the lower trail the way Nathan had directed. She waited. Nathan came back inside 5 minutes later. He did not look toward her immediately. He went to the shelf and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she understood he was giving himself a moment to settle whatever had gone tight in him out there. He's going to circle back, Eleanor said. Yes. He didn't believe you. No. Nathan turned around. But he's not sure. That buys us time. How much time? Enough to be off this mountain before he decides to stop being polite about it. Eleanor looked at him across the cabin. The morning light through the high window fell across the side of his face, and she could see him clearly. For the first time, the years that had settled into the lines around his eyes, the set of a jaw that had been clenched against things he wouldn't say for longer than she'd been running. Why are you doing this? She asked. You could have sent me away this morning. You could have told him you'd seen a woman on the South Trail. It would have solved your problem. Would have, he said. But you didn't. No. He reached for his jacket from the hook by the door. I've spent 9 years up on this mountain doing nothing while Caldwell's kind operated down below. My brother's land is still in their hands. 11 families, you said. Could be more. He looked at the leather envelope she held. That envelope could stop it. Sending you alone on the road to Laramie means it probably won't reach Laramie. So this is about justice, she said. He looked at her steadily. It's about a lot of things, Miss Bennett. She held his gaze for a moment. Eleanor, she said, if we're going to Laramie together, you might as well call me Eleanor. Something shifted in his expression. Just at the corners, the way a man looks when something small and unexpected reaches past the part of him that keeps a rifle at half height and a 9-year distance between himself and anything that costs him something. Nathan, he said. I know. She tucked the envelope back inside her dress. I heard you tell that man on the South Trail you hadn't seen any woman up here. That was a lie. It was. You don't seem like a man who lies easily. I'm not. He opened the door. Which ought to tell you something. He walked outside to saddle the horses, and Eleanor Bennett stood in the doorway of his cabin with the summer light sharp and golden around her, and the valley below, full of men who wanted what she carried, and she thought that she had run 12 days and lost everything, and she was still somehow standing. She was still standing. She took a breath and followed him out. They left before the tracker made it back to the tree line. Nathan saddled both horses in under 10 minutes. Eleanor had watched him move through it without wasted motion, the kind of efficiency that came from years of doing everything alone and learning that speed was a form of survival. He handed her the reins of a brown mare without ceremony and swung up onto his own horse and looked at her. You ride, he asked. Enough not to fall off. That'll do for now. He turned his horse north away from the South Trail, away from the valley where she had heard men moving through the dark. Stay close. Don't talk unless I talk first. She didn't argue. She had spent 12 days learning the cost of noise. They rode through this morning in silence, and Eleanor focused on the mare beneath her and the rhythm of the mountain terrain and the leather envelope pressed flat against her ribs, and she did not let herself think about what was behind them. She thought instead about what Nathan had said in the cabin. It's about a lot of things, Miss Bennett, and the way he had not explained what the other things were, and the way she had not asked. She was starting to understand that Nathan Walker was a man who revealed himself the way mountains did, slowly and only as much as the light allowed. They had been riding for perhaps 2 hours when he pulled up short on a ridge and held one hand out to the side flat and low. Stop. She stopped. He sat very still in the saddle listening. Then he said quietly, 3 riders, northwest. They're not on the trail. Eleanor heard nothing. You're certain, she said just as quietly. I'm certain. He turned his horse slightly angling east along the ridge. Caldwell put more men out than you counted. They've got the trail covered. They're trying to box us in. Her stomach tightened. How did they move that fast? Money moves fast, he said. Ride. They came down off the mountain on the east side through country. Eleanor didn't know, and Nathan moved through it like he had walked it in the dark. So many times the terrain had become part of his memory, rather than something he had to read. She stayed close. The mare was steady under her, and Eleanor was grateful for that, because her arm had started to ache again with the riding motion, and she was not about to say so. They stopped at midday beside a creek to water the horses. Eleanor climbed down and held the reins and let the mare drink, and Nathan crouched at the water's edge and refilled his canteen and studied the hills to the west without speaking. Eleanor opened her envelope and checked the documents. Still dry, still intact. She counted the way she had counted them every day for 12 days, 15 pages, 2 survey maps, 4 letters, in Caldwell's own hand. 1 letter signed by a territorial judge that her father had died trying to protect. You do that every time we stop, Nathan said without turning. Yes. You're checking they're real. She looked at him. I'm checking they're still there. Same thing. He stood and capped the canteen. After 12 days of carrying something that got your father killed, you'd want to keep reminding yourself it exists. She put the documents away. You're more observant than you let on. I let on plenty. You let on almost nothing. He looked at her, then not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, a brief shift around the eyes that was gone before she could be certain she'd seen it. You've known me less than a day. 14 hours, she said. I've been counting. Why? She thought about it honestly. Because every hour I'm still alive and still moving toward Laramie is an hour Caldwell didn't win, she said. I've been counting hours for 12 days. It's the only arithmetic that's made sense. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the horses. Then he said, "When we get to Laramie, this judge your father trusted. You've never met him yourself." "No. You're riding toward a man you've never met in a town you've never been to hand him evidence in a case that's already gotten at least 2 people killed." He looked at her. "That's a significant act of faith." "My father trusted him." "Your father is dead." It wasn't cruel. He said it the way he said everything, directly, without decoration, because he was a man who had learned that kindness dressed up as softness got people hurt. She heard it for what it was. "I know that," she said. "I know what my father trusted, and I know what it cost him. And I know that if I do nothing with what he left me, then what it cost him was everything for nothing." She looked at the envelope. "I'm not capable of letting it be nothing." Nathan picked up his reins. He stood with them for a moment, his horse shifting slightly beside him, and he looked at her the way he had looked at the valley that morning, like he was reading something he hadn't expected to find. "Let's move," he said. They made 6 more miles before the first shot. It came from the eastern slope high and to the right, and it kicked up dirt 3 feet ahead of Nathan's horse. The animal lurched, and Nathan had it controlled before Eleanor had fully processed the sound. His hands steady on the reins, his body low over the horse's neck, already moving. "East Ravine," he said sharply. "Now, go." She went. She pushed the mare hard and low along the ravine wall, following the line Nathan cut, and she heard a second shot that went wide, and then a third that she couldn't place. And then Nathan was beside her, and they were through the ravine mouth and into the heavy pine cover on the other side before another shot came. They rode hard for 10 minutes and then pulled up in the trees where the cover was thickest. Both horses were breathing. Eleanor was breathing. Nathan looked back the way they'd come, jaw set, reading something in the silence. "1 shooter," he said. "Maybe 2. They weren't trying to hit us." She stared at him. "That felt like trying to hit us. If they'd been trying, they'd have shot the horses first." He looked at her, and the directness of it was steadying rather than frightening. "They were pushing us, driving us east." "Away from the Laramie Road?" "Yes." He turned his horse, slowly reading the terrain. "Somebody knows this country. Somebody who grew up in it, or spent years in it." He paused. "That tracker I sent down the South Trail. He knows I sent him the wrong direction. He's using that now." "He's hurting us," Eleanor said. "Trying to." Nathan looked north, then east, then back at her. "There's a ranch about 12 miles northeast of here. A woman named Ruth Calloway. She's been out here 20 years. She knew my brother before he died. She's not a soft woman, and she won't ask too many questions. We can rest the horses and think through the route." "Is she safe to trust?" "As safe as anyone I know." Eleanor thought about what that meant, coming from a man who trusted essentially no one. "Then we go," she said. They rode northeast, away from the road they needed, further from Laramie than she'd been that morning, and Eleanor gripped the mare's reins and told herself that a detour was not a defeat. She had learned that in the mountains. Detours were just longer ways to the same place. Ruth Calloway was 63 years old and built like someone who had made a private arrangement with stubbornness somewhere in her early life and had been honoring it ever since. She opened her door before they reached the gate. She'd heard them coming. Or maybe she'd just developed the instinct every person alone in open country eventually developed, and she looked at Nathan, and then at Eleanor, and then at the horses and said, "You're being followed." "Yes," Nathan said. "How many?" "At least 4 now. Could be more." "Get those horses in the barn," she said, "and get yourselves inside before somebody on that ridge has something interesting to look at." Inside Ruth's place was spare, but not barren. The home of a woman who had long since decided that what she kept should earn its place. She put coffee on without asking whether they wanted it, which Eleanor found immediately comforting, and she sat across from them at the table and looked at Eleanor the way older women sometimes looked at younger ones. Not with pity, but with a particular recognition. The look of someone who had once been in a version of the same situation and was measuring the younger woman for what she was made of. "What are you carrying?" Ruth asked. Eleanor told her. The full version this time: her father, the documents, Caldwell, the judges, the surveyor who had disappeared. Ruth listened without interrupting, her coffee cup between both hands. Her face unreadable in the way that was different from Nathan's unreadable. His was guarded. Hers was simply composed. When Eleanor finished, Ruth looked at Nathan. "Same company that took Daniel's land," Nathan said. "I know it is," Ruth said. "I've known it for years." She set her cup down. "Daniel wasn't the first, Nathan. There were 2 others before him on the lower valley, and one after. I wrote a letter to the county recorder when it happened the 3rd time. Got a very polite letter back, telling me property disputes were outside my area of concern." Something crossed Nathan's face that Eleanor had not seen there before. Not the careful control she'd grown accustomed to in 14 hours of his company, but something older and rawer moving beneath it. "You never told me there were others," he said. "You were living up a mountain. What was I going to tell you? Come down and do what exactly?" Ruth's voice was not unkind, but it was clear. "You weren't ready to hear it until there was something to be done about it." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Eleanor watched him absorb it, the news that his brother's death had not been an isolated wound, but one instance of a pattern, that the grief he had carried alone up a mountain for nearly a decade had company he hadn't known about. She watched him work through it without showing most of it the way she imagined he worked through everything internally, with great cost and little witness. "The documents in that envelope," she said to Ruth. "Do they connect to the other cases? Could they help those families too?" Ruth looked at her steadily. "If the surveyor documented what I think he documented, yes. The original land grants would all come from the same set of forged patents. Blow one open in federal court, and the rest come down too." She paused. "It's a big if." "It's what's in there," Eleanor said. "I've read every page." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "How old are you?" 27. "Your father raised you right." She stood and went to the window, not to look out. She moved away from the table when she was thinking. Eleanor guessed the same way Nathan drove fence posts when he was working something through. "There's a problem with Laramie." Eleanor felt the cold move through her. "What problem?" "The judge you're headed to, Theodore Marsh." "Yes. Do you know him?" "I know of him. And I know that 2 weeks ago a man I trust told me that Caldwell made a trip to Laramie." Ruth turned back from the window. Now maybe that trip was about mining contracts or railroad business or any of a dozen other things Caldwell has his hands in. Maybe. Her voice made plain she didn't believe the maybe. Or maybe Caldwell has reason to believe someone is headed to Laramie with something he doesn't want Judge Marsh to see. The silence in the room had a weight to it. Eleanor looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Eleanor. "He knows where I'm going," Eleanor said. It came out quieter than she intended. "He knows where your father would have gone," Ruth corrected, "which means he knows where you'd go." She sat back down. "The question is whether Marsh is still trustworthy, or whether Caldwell got to him in that 2-week window." "How do we find out without walking into it?" Eleanor asked. Nathan said, "We send someone first." Both women looked at him. "Someone Caldwell's men don't know," he said. "Someone who can get to Laramie ahead of us and read the situation before we ride in with the documents." He looked at Ruth. "I don't suppose you've got a reliable man I could send." Ruth's mouth curved slightly. "I've got better than that." She stood again and went to the back of the house, and they heard her open a door and say something in a low voice. And then she came back, followed by a young man, maybe 19, with the look of someone who had been listening since they arrived and had simply been waiting for permission to be useful. "My nephew," Ruth said. "Eli. He's been riding between here and Laramie carrying my correspondence for 3 years. Nobody on that road knows his face." Eli looked at Eleanor with frank, serious eyes. "You need me to scout the judge." "I need to know whether Judge Marsh has had any unusual visitors in the last 2 weeks," Eleanor said. "Whether there's been any change in his schedule. Whether anyone around the courthouse has been asking questions about incoming cases." "I can do that," Eli said. "I can be there and back in 2 days if I leave now." Eleanor looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Eli with the particular look of a man assessing whether someone was capable, not whether they were willing. Whatever he found, he nodded once. 2 days, Nathan said to Eleanor. We stay here 2 days. And if Eli comes back and tells us the judge has been compromised, Eleanor asked. Nobody answered immediately. The question sat there between them because it was the question that had no good answer. If Laramie was closed, there was nowhere else in reach that a federal case of this size could be heard. There was no plan past Laramie. Laramie was the plan. Then we think of something else, Nathan said. That is a very thin contingency. Yes. He looked at her without apology. It is. Eli left within the hour. Ruth fed them and gave Eleanor the spare room and Nathan a blanket by the fire, and the house settled into the particular quiet of people who were waiting on something they couldn't control. Eleanor lay in the spare room and stared at the ceiling and held the envelope on her chest and tried to think clearly about Laramie and Judge Marsh and the 2-week gap that Caldwell might or might not have used to close the one door that mattered. She thought about her father. She thought about him sitting at the table in their ranch house going through documents by lamplight, making careful notes in his precise, small handwriting. She thought about the way he had always told her that justice was not a feeling. It was a decision that you decided to pursue it, regardless of the cost, or you decided not to, and everything else was just the noise of that decision playing out. She had made her decision 12 days ago. She wasn't revising it now. The second day was harder than the first. Nathan was up before light again, and Eleanor found him in the yard behind Ruth's barn. And this time she didn't bring him coffee. She just went and stood near where he was working and waited, because she had learned something about him in 36 hours that she suspected most people never learned. In 36 months, he didn't need filling up with words. He needed someone to be present without demanding anything from the presence. She wasn't sure how she knew that about him. She knew it the way you know some things, not from evidence but from attention. "Tell me about Daniel," she said. He didn't answer right away. He kept working. He was mending a section of Ruth's fence that had gone loose because Nathan Walker apparently responded to waiting by finding the nearest thing that needed fixing. "What do you want to know?" he said finally. "Whatever you want to tell." Another pause. "He was younger than me by 7 years. Stubborn the way young men are when they're good at things, and haven't been wrong enough times to know better." His voice was measured. "He worked that land for 4 years before Caldwell's men came. Built a house on it. Had plans to marry. Was there someone? A woman from the valley. She left after he died." He drove a nail. "Can't blame her. She had her own life to get on with." "Did you blame her at the time?" "At the time I blamed everyone." He set the hammer down for a moment. The company, the judges, the sheriff who wouldn't hear Daniel's complaint. The woman who left the town that went quiet and let it happen. Myself most of all. "Why yourself?" "Because I was his older brother, and I was 33 years old, and I had a reputation in that valley as a man who could handle a situation, and I did not handle that one." He picked the hammer back up. "I went up the mountain instead. I left. I told myself it was because there was nothing to be done. But the truth was that being around people who knew what had happened and who had done nothing about it, I couldn't bear it. So I removed myself from the situation." "That's not cowardice," Eleanor said. "That's grief." "Those two things can look the same for a long time," he said. She thought about that. She thought about her own 12 days of running the way she had framed it to herself as purpose, as mission. Because the alternative was to feel the full weight of what had happened to her father, and if she felt that she would stop moving, and she couldn't stop moving. "Nathan," she said. He looked at her. "You didn't go back up the mountain when you had the chance to," she said. "Yesterday, after we left your cabin, you could have pointed me toward the eastern road and turned around. You didn't." "No. That matters." He looked at her for a long moment, the same look she'd seen in his cabin when she said his name across the table with the documents between them. Something being reached past. "It's not enough," he said. "Riding with you to Laramie doesn't make up for 10 years of not going." "No," she agreed. "But it's not about making up for things. It's about what you do with the time you have left." She held his gaze. "My father used to say that. I thought it was something people said when they ran out of better things to say. I understand it differently now." Nathan looked at the fence. He looked at the hills. He looked at the envelope she carried always pressed beneath her arm like a second heartbeat. "Your father sounds like he was a good man," he said. "How was the best man I knew?" She paused. "Until about 36 hours ago." He turned away before she could see his face fully. But she saw enough. Eli came back on the afternoon of the second day, riding faster than departure, and Eleanor heard him before she saw him and was already on her feet when he came through Ruth's door. His face told her something was wrong before his mouth opened. "Judge Marsh left Laramie," he said. "3 days ago. Nobody knows where he went. His clerk says he had a personal matter. But—" Eli looked at Eleanor and then at Nathan. "There's a man at the courthouse, asking questions. Asking whether anyone had heard from a woman named Bennett traveling from Colorado." The name hit the air of the room like a stone hitting water. They already knew she was going to Laramie. They already knew her name. They had gotten there first. Eleanor looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Eleanor. And Ruth Calloway looked at both of them and said in the voice of a woman who had lived 20 years in open country and outlasted most of the crises that had come at her, "Then you need a different door." "What door?" Eleanor asked. Ruth went to her writing desk and pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. "There is a circuit court magistrate operating out of Cheyenne. He's not a federal judge. He can't hear the full case. But he has authority to certify evidence and forward it to the federal circuit with a recommendation." She kept writing. "And unlike Theodore Marsh, nobody has had reason to get to him yet, because nobody would expect you to go to Cheyenne." "Cheyenne is 3 days further than Laramie," Nathan said. "Yes," Ruth said. "With Caldwell's men behind us." "Yes." He looked at Eleanor. Not asking for her decision, he knew her decision. He was looking at her the way you look at someone when you want to confirm that what you see is what you think you see. That the thing you've come to rely on in 36 hours of hard country is as solid as it seems. Eleanor lifted the envelope and tucked it back inside her dress. "Cheyenne," she said. Ruth finished writing and folded the letter and handed it to Eleanor. "Give this to the magistrate. He'll know my name. We met 15 years ago in a land dispute of my own, one I won." A pause. "He's an honest man. I'd stake my land on it." "You may be staking ours," Eleanor said. "I know it." Ruth looked at her without flinching. "That's why I'm doing it." They left at dusk. Not the safest time to ride, but Nathan said that Caldwell's men would expect them to rest through the night and move at dawn, and meeting expectations was not something he was inclined to do. Eleanor had learned in the hours since the tracker on the South Trail that Nathan's instincts about human behavior were the same as his instincts about weather worth listening to and rarely wrong. She rode beside him through the fading summer light, and behind them Ruth's ranch grew small, and ahead of them the country opened up into 3 more days of road, with the documents against her chest and the name of a magistrate in Cheyenne written on a folded letter in her pocket. 3 days. New territory. Caldwell's men between them and every road that mattered. Eleanor Bennett gripped her reins and kept riding. She was still counting hours. She had not stopped counting. They rode through the first night in shifts of silence, broken only by the sounds of the horses and the occasional distant sound that Nathan would stop for assess and then continue past. Eleanor had stopped asking whether every sound was something to worry about. She had learned to read Nathan's stillness when it meant danger, and when it meant nothing more than a man checking the world around him the way other men checked their pockets. By the second hour of riding, she knew the difference. She did not know how she knew it. She knew it the way she had come to know several things about him through attention paid without his awareness. They stopped before dawn in a stand of cottonwoods by a creek. Nathan knew and watered the horses and ate what Ruth had packed and did not speak much. Eleanor's arm ached. She did not mention it. Nathan looked at it once briefly and then looked away, and she understood that he had seen the way she was holding it and had chosen to let her keep her silence on the matter, which was its own form of respect. 3 days to Cheyenne, she said, when they'd been stopped long enough that speaking felt natural. 2.5 if we push, he said. But pushing means the horses need more rest at the other end, and if we need the horses in a hurry when we get there. 3 days, she agreed. 3 days. He looked at the creek. Caldwell's man in Laramie. He knows your name. That means Caldwell has been in front of us the whole time. He's had 12 days to prepare, she said. I knew he would be. Knowing it and riding into it are different things. He looked at her. Did your father have any other contacts? Anyone we could send word to? Someone in Cheyenne or along the route who could receive the documents if something happens to us before we arrive? Eleanor had thought about this. She had thought about it in the dark of Ruth's spare room while she stared at the ceiling and mapped every possibility she could reach. My father had a contact in Cheyenne, she said slowly. A newspaper editor, Harold Fitch. He was the one who told my father about the surveyor in the first place. The surveyor fed information to Fitch before he disappeared. She paused. I don't know if Fitch is still in Cheyenne. I don't know whether Caldwell has reached him. But if he's there and he's clean, Nathan said, a newspaper editor with copies of those documents is harder to silence than a woman on a road, Eleanor finished. Yes, I've been thinking that. We go to Fitch first, Nathan said. Before the magistrate. If Fitch can make copies and hold them somewhere safe, then even if something goes wrong at the courthouse. The documents still exist, Eleanor said. The case still exists. Yes. She looked at him in the early gray light. He had been riding for most of the night, and he looked like a man who had been riding for most of the night, tired in the body, fully alert in the mind, which she was beginning to understand was simply his natural state. She thought about the 9 years he had spent up that mountain alone, and she thought that loneliness at that scale either broke a person or made them extraordinarily capable of depending entirely on themselves. She could see both of those things in him. The capability was obvious. The breaking was quieter, but it was there if you paid attention. Nathan, she said, how long has it been since you trusted someone? He looked at her for a long moment. Why? Because you're making good decisions that require you to trust my account of things. My father's contacts. The magistrate Ruth vouches for. Eli's report on Laramie. She held his gaze. You're extending a lot of trust for a man who spent 9 years extending none. He looked away. I reckon I'm making up for lost time. Or, she said, you've decided it's worth it. I didn't answer that. He stood and gathered his reins and checked the cinch on his horse with the practiced motion of someone ending a conversation by returning to the physical. Eleanor let it go. She had learned that too. Some things with Nathan Walker needed to be planted and left because he was a man who processed things in his own time, and the worst thing you could do was crowd the process. She stood and gathered her own reins, and they moved back out into the early morning country and continued north. The trouble found them before noon. Not Caldwell's men, something Eleanor hadn't anticipated, which was its own lesson about the road. They were crossing a wide-open stretch of grassland, unavoidably exposed in the late morning summer light, when Nathan pulled up sharply, and she pulled up beside him and saw what he'd seen: a wagon on its side off the road ahead, a horse down, and a figure crouched beside the wheel. Nathan's hand went to his rifle, then stopped. Woman, he said quietly. Eleanor looked. He was right. A woman, maybe 50, bent over the downed horse. No visible men anywhere in the visible range of the road. The wagon had shed its load sacks and crates scattered across the grass. Could be staged, Nathan said. Could be, Eleanor agreed. She thought about it for 2 seconds. But if it's not and we ride past, I know. He moved forward. Eleanor stayed a half-length behind him, out of caution, watching the tree lines on both sides of the road while he rode toward the woman. No movement. No sound wrong. No glint of anything in the brush. She was not good at this yet, reading the country for threat, but she was getting better, and everything she could assess read as genuine. The woman looked up as they approached. Her face was streaked with dust and tears, and the particular expression of someone who had been having a crisis for long enough that the shock had burned off, and what was left was simply exhaustion. My horse came down on a gopher hole, she said before Nathan had even fully stopped. I've been here 2 hours. She's not badly hurt. I think it's the leg, but I can't right the wagon alone and I can't leave her. Nathan dismounted and went to the horse. Eleanor watched him crouch and run his hands down the animal's leg, with the same calm, methodical attention he gave everything, and the horse, which had been breathing hard, seemed to slow its breathing under his hands. "Not broken," he said. "She needs to rest the leg, but she can be moved." He looked up at the woman. "Your name?" "Agnes Pruitt. I'm headed to Casper. My son is expecting me. We can right the wagon and get your horse up. Then you're on your own. We can't ride with you." Agnes Pruitt looked at him and then at Eleanor. She was the kind of woman who had been reading people for 50 years and didn't need much time. "You're running from something," she said. "We're moving with purpose," Nathan said. "Same thing out here." She stood and wiped her hands on her skirts. "I won't slow you down. And I won't ask what it is." She paused. "But I will tell you that there were 3 riders on this road behind me this morning, an hour back, moving faster than they should have been for pleasure travel. They didn't stop to help me." Nathan went very still. What did they look like? Armed, dressed for business, not for leisure. Agnes Pruitt looked at Eleanor's envelope tucked as always against her body. One of them had a tracker's rig, rope and reading glass, and the kind of patience in the saddle that takes years. The tracker. He had picked up their trail. Nathan looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Nathan. The calculation was fast and shared if the tracker was an hour behind them, and they stopped to help this woman. The gap closed to under an hour, possibly less. "We'll right the wagon," Nathan said. He turned to the horse. "Nathan," Eleanor started. "5 minutes," he said. "We're not leaving her on an open road with those men behind us." Eleanor dismounted and helped. The wagon was heavy, but not impossible, and with Nathan on one side and Eleanor and Agnes on the other. They got it righted and reloaded the scattered goods in under the 5 minutes Nathan had said. The horse was gentled to her feet by Nathan's hands and stood well enough, and Agnes Pruitt looked at them both with the kind of gratitude that didn't need embellishing. "North Road branches in 12 miles, Nathan said to her. "Take the right branch. It adds 6 miles to Casper, but the road is used enough that you won't be alone on it." "Thank you," Agnes said. She looked at Eleanor. "Whatever you're carrying, I hope you get it where it needs to go." "Thank you, ma'am," Eleanor said. They rode. Nathan set a harder pace after that, and Eleanor matched it without complaint. Her arm was protesting seriously. Now the jarring of the faster ride had woken something in the cut that she had been keeping quiet through sheer will, and she finally said, when they stopped to breathe the horses on a long uphill stretch, "I need to change the dressing on my arm." He was off his horse before she finished the sentence. He did it without commentary. Unwrapped the old linen, examined the cut with the same focus he'd given Agnes Pruitt's horse, cleaned it with what he had in his saddlebag, and rewrapped it. His hands were careful. The particular careful of someone who was being very deliberate about their own carefulness, which Eleanor noticed and said nothing about. "It's not infected," he said. "I know, it just hurts. You should have said something this morning. You had things to think about this morning." He tied off the linen and looked up at her. They were close. She had needed to hold still, and there was not much room between them on the narrow uphill trail. She could see the lines around his eyes up close, the particular weathering of skin that came from years of outdoor work and mountain light, and she thought that he had probably been a different kind of man before Daniel and Caldwell, and 9 years of deliberate solitude. Not a softer man, but one with less scar tissue in the places that didn't show. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes." "Tell me if something hurts." He let her arm go and stepped back. "I can't adjust for things I don't know about." "I will," she said. He looked at her for a moment like he didn't entirely believe her. She couldn't blame him. He was probably right. "Let's move," he said. The first large twist hit them at the river crossing, 9 miles north of where they'd helped Agnes Pruitt, and it came not from behind them, but from directly ahead, and it was worse than anything the tracker could have delivered. Standing at the crossing, the only crossing for 4 miles in either direction, a fact Nathan had mentioned once, and which apparently someone else also knew, was a man Eleanor recognized. Not Caldwell's tracker. Not one of the 3 riders. A man named Garrett Holt, who had been the Bennett family's ranch foreman for 6 years, who had been gone from their property when Eleanor arrived to find the Caldwell men in her doorway, who she had assumed had simply saved himself by leaving. He was standing beside his horse at the water's edge, and when he saw her, he didn't look surprised. He looked relieved. That was the thing that hit her first. Not fear, not anger, but a terrible confusion at the relief on his face, because a man who had betrayed her should not look relieved to see her, and she had enough respect for her own instincts to let that confusion sit and be read, rather than filling it in with assumption. Nathan had his rifle up. "Wait," Eleanor said. Nathan didn't lower it, but he waited. Garrett Holt put both hands out, palms forward, and he said, "Miss Eleanor, I am not here for them, I swear it. I'm here because of what your father told me to do if things went wrong." Eleanor stared at him from across the crossing. "You left," she said. "When they came, you were gone." "I know how that looks," Garrett said. "Please let me explain it." "Nathan," Eleanor said quietly, "he worked for my father for 6 years. Does that make him trustworthy right now?" Nathan said just as quietly. "I don't know. But his hands are up and he's not running, and he's telling me my father gave him instructions." She looked at Garrett across the water. "Speak, quickly." "Your father sent me away 3 days before they came," Garrett said. "He knew it was coming. He told me to go to Cheyenne and wait for you. He told me you'd come north eventually because you'd know to go to federal authority, and he told me to watch the northern routes." His voice was steady, but not comfortable. "He told me to find Harold Fitch when I got to Cheyenne and tell him you were coming. He told me—" Garrett stopped. He looked at the envelope pressed against her body, and his voice changed. "He told me you'd be carrying his insurance policy." The creek moved between them. A bird called once high and clean. Her father had done this. Before they came. While he was still alive, while he was still putting pieces in motion, he had sent Garrett north with instructions, because he had known he might not survive it, and he had laid a path for her anyway. Eleanor's throat closed briefly. She let it close and breathe back open without showing more than the barest flicker of it. "Harold Fitch," she said. "Is he still in Cheyenne?" "As of 5 days ago, yes," Garrett said. "And he's been waiting. He knows about the documents. He's been sitting on a story for 8 months, waiting for someone to bring him the evidence to run it." Nathan still had not lowered the rifle. "How do we know Caldwell didn't send you to push us toward Fitch if Fitch has been turned?" Garrett looked at him directly. "You don't. Not for certain." He looked at Eleanor. "Miss Eleanor, I worked for your father for 6 years. I watched him build that ranch from nothing. I watched him put those documents together paper by paper, knowing what it might cost him. When he sent me away, he shook my hand, and he said—" Garrett's voice broke briefly, a single breach in the steadiness, and then he brought it back. "He said she's going to need someone who knows her face when she gets there. You be that person." The silence after that was the particular silence of truth landing in a room, or in this case, a river crossing on a summer morning in open country. Eleanor looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Eleanor. She crossed the water first. Nathan came through behind her rifle still raised, and he did not lower it until he was close enough to look Garrett Holt in the eyes. Whatever he found there, Nathan Walker, who had spent 9 years learning to read the only things that couldn't lie to him, which were the land and the weather and the look in a person's face. Before they made a decision, he slowly brought the rifle down. "You have a horse," Nathan said to Garrett. "Yes." "Can you ride hard?" "Yes." "Then you're riding with us," Nathan said. He looked at Eleanor. "Fitch first, before the magistrate." "Agreed," she said. Garrett looked at the envelope. "Miss Eleanor, there's something else your father told me to tell you, if I found you, if you'd made it this far." She looked at him. "He said—" Garrett straightened. "He said you were the best thing he'd ever done right in his life. And he said not to stop." Eleanor stood with that for one breath. 2. Then she turned to her horse and gathered the reins and swung up. "Let's ride," she said. They made the outskirts of Cheyenne by the 3rd afternoon, coming in on the eastern approach that Garrett knew, a route that bypassed the main road and the northern entry, where anyone watching would expect travelers from the Montana direction. Eleanor had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since Ruth's place, and the arithmetic she'd been running in her head had grown more complex. Fitch, the magistrate, the documents. Caldwell's man at the Laramie courthouse, who might have moved the tracker, who was maybe a day behind them now, maybe less. 3 moving pieces. 3 places this could fall apart. Nathan rode beside her and said nothing, and she was grateful for the nothing. Harold Fitch's newspaper office was a narrow 2-story building on a side street 3 blocks from the main thoroughfare. Garrett led them to it without hesitation. He had been here 5 days ago. He knew the route, and he went in first alone, while Nathan and Eleanor waited outside with the horses and watched the street in both directions. 2 minutes. 3. Eleanor counted. At 4 minutes, Garrett appeared in the doorway and waved them in. Harold Fitch was a small man in his late 50s, with ink-stained hands and the restless energy of a man who had been holding a large and important thing in place for a very long time and was ready to put it down. He looked at Eleanor when she walked through the door, and he said without preamble, "Thomas Bennett's daughter." "Yes," she said. "You have the documents." She pulled the envelope from inside her dress and put it on his desk. He looked at it, but did not immediately touch it. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I want to tell you something before we go any further. Caldwell's men came to my office 3 days ago." The room sharpened. "What did they want?" Nathan said from behind Eleanor. "They wanted to know whether I'd had any contact with a woman traveling from Colorado." Fitch looked at Eleanor calmly. "I told them I received a good deal of correspondence from all parts of the territory, and I couldn't be expected to track the origins of every letter." A pause. "They did not believe me. They told me that if I received any packages of interest, it would be in my best professional interest to send word to their employer before doing anything else with the contents." "And will you?" Eleanor said. "Miss Bennett," Fitch said quietly, "I have been waiting 8 months to run this story. I watched a good man build an airtight case that should have protected 11 families, and instead got him killed. I watched a surveyor named James Colt feed me information for 4 months and then disappear without a trace." He looked at the envelope. "I am not in the business of sending word to the men who make those things happen." He reached for the envelope and opened it. Eleanor watched him read. She watched the progression across his face, professional recognition. First, then something harder and more personal, and then a controlled fury that settled into his jaw and his hands and stayed there. "These are exactly what Thomas told me they'd be," Fitch said after a long time. "Survey maps, signed orders, Caldwell's correspondence, Judge Holloway's signature on the fraudulent patents." He looked up. "This will run on the front page of every paper in the territory, and with a federal filing alongside it." "The magistrate," Nathan said. "Judge Arthur Briggs," Fitch confirmed. "He's here. He's not compromised, I'd know if he were. I've been watching." He stood. "But we have a problem." Eleanor waited. "Caldwell knows you're coming to Cheyenne, or whether someone at Ruth Calloway's place talked, or whether it's simply that a man with Caldwell's money employs enough people to watch every route north. But I received a message this morning from a source inside the land company offices." He turned the message on his desk to face them. Nathan read it. His face went the flat, careful neutral that Eleanor now knew meant something was costing him to keep contained. She read it over his arm. 3 words, handwritten on company letterhead. "She arrives today." They already knew she was in Cheyenne. "When was this sent?" Nathan asked. "This morning, which means whoever sent it had reason to believe you were close." Fitch looked at Eleanor. "Miss Bennett, I can make copies of these documents in under an hour. I can have them in 3 separate secure locations before nightfall. But if Caldwell's men move on the magistrate's office before you file, then the case gets buried," Eleanor said. "Or worse. If they present a counter-filing and Briggs sees it before he sees yours, they can tie up the proceedings long enough for Caldwell to relocate his assets and disappear." Fitch looked at Nathan. "How fast can you get her to Briggs' office?" "How far?" Nathan said. 6 blocks. Nathan looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Nathan. In that look was 36 hours of hard road and 3 days of being one step behind a man with enough money to reach every room before they got there, And it was also underneath all of that, the specific look that had been passing between them with increasing frequency. The look of two people who have been through enough together in a short time to know without speaking it that they are going to see the thing through to its end. "Then we go now," Eleanor said. "This moment, before they know we're in the building." "The copies," Fitch started. "You make the copies. We take the originals to Briggs. If something happens to us between here and 6 blocks." She looked at Fitch. "You have what you have." Fitch nodded slowly. "All right." He put his hand out across the desk. "Your father would be proud of you, Miss Bennett." Eleanor shook his hand. She didn't trust herself to say anything about her father in that moment, so she said, "Print the truth, Mr. Fitch." "I have been waiting 8 months to do exactly that." Nathan was already at the door, reading the street through the narrow front window, his rifle in hand. He turned to Eleanor. "2 men," he said quietly. "East end of the street. One's watching the building." Garrett came to the window. "I know the alley route to the courthouse. Back door. It comes out half a block south of Briggs' office." "Then we go through the back," Nathan said. He looked at Eleanor. "Stay between us. Don't stop for anything." Eleanor tucked the envelope inside her dress one final time, the last time she thought, because one way or another, this was ending in the next 6 blocks, and she said, "I've been walking toward this moment for 12 days. I don't intend to stop now." They went through the back. The alley was narrow and running fast, and Eleanor kept pace between Nathan and Garrett, and she was aware of things the way you were aware of them when everything had narrowed to its essential shape. The sound of her boots on the packed ground, the weight of the envelope against her ribs, the sound of voices somewhere behind the building that might have been ordinary street noise and might not have been. Nathan was slightly ahead. He moved differently in tight quarters, not smaller, but condensed somehow, all that stillness focused forward. Garrett was half a step behind Eleanor, watching their rear. They came out of the alley onto a side street and turned south. 1 block. 2. "Nathan." Garrett's voice low and sharp. Eleanor looked. Ahead of them at the corner, a man was looking directly at them. He was not the... She had never seen the tracker's face, but he had the same professional patience in his posture, the same deliberate positioning that said he was not standing on that corner by accident. Nathan didn't break stride. He walked directly toward the man, unhurried, one hand loose at his side, and he looked at him the way you looked at a problem you had already decided how to handle. The man watched Nathan come. He looked at Eleanor behind him. He looked at the building on his left, Briggs's office, one of the buildings on this block. Nathan had calculated it, and Eleanor saw the calculation happen behind his eyes. The weighing of what he had been told to do against the reality of Nathan Walker walking toward him at a pace that did not intend to stop. He stepped aside. Nathan walked past him without a word, and Eleanor walked past without looking at him, and Garrett went last. They went through Briggs' office door 2 seconds later. Judge Arthur Briggs was a broad-shouldered man with white hair and reading glasses and the expression of someone who had been doing serious work for many years and did not appreciate interruption. He looked up when they came through the door, all 3 of them, and he started to speak. Eleanor put the envelope on his desk. "My name is Eleanor Grace Bennett," she said. "My father was Thomas Bennett of Bennett Ranch, Colorado. He was killed 3 months ago for gathering this evidence. I have been 12 days on foot and on horseback getting it to this office. The man who had it fabricated is named Gerald Caldwell. He owns the Continental Land and Settlement Company. The evidence in that envelope documents fraudulent land patents on 400 acres, the forged signatures of 2 territorial judges, and correspondence proving. Caldwell ordered the fraud personally." She looked at Briggs steadily. "I was told you are an honest man. I am asking you to prove it." Briggs looked at the envelope. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Nathan standing to one side and Garrett on the other. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed them slowly on his sleeve. Then he put them back on. He reached for the envelope. Outside in the street, there was a sound. Voices, the movement of horses, the particular urgency of men arriving somewhere in a hurry. Briggs opened the envelope and read the first page without looking up. Nathan moved to the window. Eleanor stood at Briggs's desk and kept her eyes on his face while he read, because this was the moment everything had been moving toward, and she was not going to miss it. She had run 12 days for this. She was still standing. She was going to watch it happen. Briggs read the first page, and then the second, and he did not speak, and he did not look up, and the room held its breath around him. Outside, the voices in the street were getting closer. Nathan stood at the window with his rifle at his side and tracked the movement out there without reporting it, because Eleanor understood that if it were immediately urgent, he would say so. And the fact that he said nothing meant they had a few more minutes, and a few more minutes was what Briggs needed. She watched the judge's face. She had gotten very good at reading faces in the last 15 days, not because she'd been trained in it, but because when your survival depends on knowing who is with you and who is not you, learn fast, or you pay for the slowness. Briggs had the face of a man who had seen fraudulent documents before and knew the difference between a manufactured grievance and the genuine architecture of a crime. She watched him recognize this difference. She watched his jaw tighten on the third page, the correspondence between Caldwell and Judge Holloway, written in the casual shorthand of men who had been doing something dishonest long enough to be comfortable about it. She watched something settle into Briggs's expression that was not anger exactly, but the thing that lived just behind anger in a man who had spent his career in the service of law and understood precisely what it meant when someone had been using that service as a weapon. He turned the fourth page. "How many families?" he said, not looking up. 11 confirmed, Eleanor said. Possibly more who never filed any record of the dispute because they had no resources to fight and didn't know what to fight. This surveyor. Briggs tapped the copied survey maps. James Colt. He disappeared 3 months ago. We believe Caldwell had him removed. You believe, or you have evidence? I believe, Eleanor said steadily. I don't have evidence of that specific act. What I have is in front of you. Briggs turned another page. The signatures on these patents. Holloway's and Morrison's. Both territorial judges. Both connected to Caldwell's operation, according to the correspondence on page 6. He went to page 6. He read it twice. The second time, something in his posture changed, a straightening the kind that happened when a man stopped reading and started deciding. Nathan said quietly from the window. Eleanor. She looked at him. His head tilted slightly toward the door, not urgency, not yet, but close. Judge Briggs, she said, I need to know what you're going to do. Briggs set the documents down flat on his desk and looked at her over his glasses. Miss Bennett, what I am going to do is certify this evidence, prepare an emergency filing to the Federal Circuit in Denver, and send a wire immediately to the U.S. Marshal's office requesting federal officers be dispatched to this jurisdiction. He paused. What I am going to need from you is a signed affidavit attesting to how this evidence was obtained and the chain of custody from your father to this office. Now. Right now, my clerk will take your statement in the next room. He was already reaching for paper. I will have a deputy standing outside this office within 10 minutes. Nobody is going to walk in here and take these documents. The relief that moved through Eleanor was so large and sudden that it almost buckled her. She stood against it and let it pass through without showing more than a brief closing of her eyes, one breath too, and then she opened them and she was steady again. She looked at Nathan. He was already looking at her. He said nothing. Neither did she. It was the kind of moment that didn't need words, and both of them were constitutionally unsuited to using words when silence was more honest. Then the door to Briggs' office opened, and 3 men walked in, and the moment ended. The man in front was not one of Caldwell's hired riders. He was dressed too well for that, a suit not trail clothes, a hat that had been blocked recently, the particular grooming of a man who wanted you to know he operated at a certain level. He was perhaps 55 broad across the chest, with the practiced authority of someone who had spent years walking into rooms and finding people willing to move out of his way. Eleanor knew immediately who he was. She had never met him. She had seen his name on the documents in front of Briggs so many times that his face felt already known to her, the way a villain in a story feels known before you encounter him in the flesh. Gerald Caldwell. He looked at the documents on Briggs's desk. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Nathan, who had turned from the window and was standing with the rifle no longer quite at his side. Then he looked at Briggs, and he smiled. It was a confident smile, the smile of a man who had walked into many rooms and found the situation already arranged in his favor, and who had no reason yet to believe this one would be different. "Arthur," he said, "I apologize for the interruption. I heard there might be some confusion about a land matter I'm involved in." "Gerald," Briggs said. His voice was flat, not hostile flat, the flatness of someone being very deliberate about showing nothing. "This is an active proceeding. Of course, I simply wanted to offer some clarity before any hasty decisions were made." Caldwell looked at Eleanor. "Miss Bennett, you've had an extraordinary journey. I understand your grief losing a father is a terrible thing. But I think if we sat down like reasonable people, we'd find that what you're carrying is based on some significant misunderstandings about your father's land title." Eleanor looked at him. She had spent 15 days being afraid of this man. She had spent 15 days running from the reach of his money and his hired patience and his ability to be in every room before she arrived. She had spent 15 days carrying the proof of what he'd done, pressed against her skin like a second heartbeat. Standing in the same room with him, looking at his practiced smile, she felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt entirely calm. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "the documents on that desk include a letter in your handwriting to Judge Holloway, dated March 14, 1883, in which you write, and I am quoting from memory, 'Ensure the Bennett filing is lost before the circuit review date. We cannot afford a federal examiner seeing the original grant records. That is not a misunderstanding about a land title. That is a conspiracy to obstruct federal land review.'" She held his gaze. "Judge Briggs has read it. He is currently preparing the federal filing. I have given my statement to his clerk. And Harold Fitch of the Cheyenne Register has copies of every page in that envelope, which are at this moment being secured in 3 separate locations." She paused. "Would you like to keep explaining the misunderstanding?" Caldwell's smile stayed in place for a moment, past the point where a real smile would have. Then it went. The man to his right moved. Nathan moved faster. The rifle came up, and Nathan put himself between Caldwell's man and Eleanor in a single step that covered the distance faster than it should have been possible, and he said, "Don't," in the voice that he apparently reserved for moments when he needed something to be the last word on a subject. It was the last word. The man stopped. Briggs stood. "Gerald Caldwell, you will remove yourself and your associates from this office, or I will have you detained right now on suspicion of interfering with a federal proceeding." He looked at the men behind Caldwell. "All 3 of you." Caldwell looked at Briggs. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Nathan and the rifle and the particular quality of Nathan Walker's stillness, which was the stillness of a man who had been waiting 9 years for something to be worth doing and had found it. "This isn't finished," Caldwell said. "Yes, it is," Eleanor said. "You just haven't accepted it yet." Caldwell left. His men left behind him. The door closed. The room breathed. Garrett, who had been standing against the far wall throughout the entire exchange, with his hand on his own sidearm, let a long breath out through his nose. "Lord Almighty," he said quietly. Nathan lowered the rifle. He looked at Eleanor. "You memorized the letter." "I read those documents every day for 15 days, she said. "I memorized all of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "That was well done," he said. Coming from Nathan Walker, she had learned that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Briggs's deputy appeared within the 10 minutes he had promised, and then a second deputy, and by the time Eleanor finished her formal statement with the clerk and came back into the main office, the federal wire had been sent, and Briggs was already drafting the certification package for Denver. He worked with the focused efficiency of a man who understood that speed was now the asset that Caldwell, having lost the room, would move to other rooms, and the faster the federal machinery engaged, the fewer rooms he had left to move in. "The U.S. Marshal's office in Denver will have this wire by this evening," Briggs said. "Federal officers can be dispatched within 48 hours. In the meantime, I am issuing a local warrant for Caldwell's detention pending federal review." He looked up. "He will try to leave Cheyenne tonight." "Can you stop him?" Nathan asked. "The sheriff can. Whether he will is a different conversation." Briggs set his pen down briefly. "Sheriff Moss and I have a complicated relationship." "Meaning," Eleanor said, "meaning he is not a corrupt man, but he is a cautious one, and Caldwell has deep pockets in this county. Briggs was already writing again. I would suggest, Miss Bennett, that you and your companions make yourselves visible in this town for the next 24 hours. The more people who know you are here, and why, the more difficult it becomes for anyone to make you quietly disappear. Nathan looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Nathan. Fitch, they said at the same time. Harold Fitch had the front page reset before sunset. Eleanor sat in his office while he worked and watched the thing she had been carrying for 15 days become something public and irreversible: words in type, evidence in print. In print, the framework of a crime laid out in the plain language of a newspaper page in a way that anyone in the territory could read and understand. She watched Fitch work with the intensity of a man who had waited 8 months for this and was not wasting a second of it. Garrett was there. Nathan was there, sitting with his back against the wall and his rifle across his knees, watching the door to Fitch's office and the window and the street beyond it, in the systematic rotation of a man who was not done being careful yet and wouldn't be until this was several degrees more settled than it currently was. The surveyor, Eleanor said to Fitch when he paused to review a proof. James Colt. He fed you the information before he disappeared. What did he tell you about where he'd gone? Fitch looked at her carefully. Why? Because if he's still alive somewhere, he's the strongest witness to testify about how the patents were fabricated. My documents prove the fraud happened. Colt can explain exactly how. Fitch set the proof down. He was quiet for a moment. He told me the last time I spoke with him that if something happened to him, he was going to try to reach a woman named Clara in Pueblo, his sister. He paused. I never followed up. I was afraid that if I started asking questions about Colt, Caldwell would know the story was closer than he thought. We need to get word to Denver, Eleanor said. To the federal marshals when they arrive. Tell them to look for Clara in Pueblo. I can send the wire tonight, Garrett said from across the room. He'd been quiet for most of the evening, but Eleanor had noticed that Garrett was a man like Nathan. In one way, he went quiet when he was thinking, and when he spoke, it was because he'd worked through something. Your father gave me contacts in Denver, Miss Eleanor. A lawyer he trusted man named Whitfield. If the marshals are already moving, Whitfield can coordinate finding Colt's sister. Eleanor looked at him. Her father had laid out an entire network before he died. Garrett Fitchfield, the path to Briggs, and he had put none of it in writing because writing could be found. He had trusted each person with only their own piece. He had trusted Eleanor with the documents, which was the piece that connected all the others. She had not understood until this moment the full architecture of what he had built. Send the wire, she said to Garrett. Tonight. Nathan from across the room, said Eleanor. She looked at him. Come outside for a minute, he said. The street outside Fitch's office was quiet at this hour, not empty, but quieted the particular evening pace of a working town, settling toward nightfall. Nathan stood on the boardwalk and looked at the street, and Eleanor stood beside him, and they were both quiet for a moment, which was comfortable in the way that silences between two people become comfortable when those people have spent enough time in hard circumstances together that they've stopped needing to fill the space. He's going to try to run tonight, Nathan said. Caldwell. Briggs thinks so too. Sheriff Moss may or may not stop him. Yes. Nathan was quiet for a moment. If he runs and the federal marshals take too long, he has money in enough places to disappear. Mexico, east. Somewhere the territorial warrants don't reach. Eleanor looked at him. What are you saying? I'm saying we can't control what happens next, he said. We got the documents to Briggs. We got Fitch printing. We got the wire to Denver. Those are the things we could do. He looked at her. The rest is out of our hands. I know that, she said. But she said it with an edge she hadn't intended, because the idea of Caldwell on a horse heading south while federal machinery ground slowly into motion was something that sat very badly in her. Eleanor. Nathan turned slightly toward her. You have been running for 15 days toward a thing that no longer requires you to run. You can stop. She looked at him. Can I? What does that mean? She was quiet for a moment, trying to find honest words for something she had not articulated yet, even to herself. It means that I have been moving toward this moment for so long that I don't know yet what happens when I'm not moving toward it anymore. I don't know what comes next. I don't know where I go. I don't have a home, they took it. I don't have my father. I have those documents, and now those documents are in Briggs's hands, and so what I've had for 15 days is finished. She looked at the street. I don't know what I am when I'm not fighting. Nathan was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. He was looking at the same street, and she could see the familiar set of his jaw working through something. When Daniel died, he said, I told myself I was going up that mountain to get clear of things, to think, to decide what to do next. He paused. And then 9 years went by, and I was still up there, and I had stopped telling myself I was deciding anything. I was just... He stopped. I was hiding, and I was comfortable enough with the hiding that I called it something else. And now, she said. He looked at her. And now I'm standing on a street in Cheyenne at the end of something that I started 15 days ago by pointing a rifle at a woman who knocked on my door. He almost said something else. She could see it form and be reconsidered. Then he said, I reckon what comes next is a question worth taking time to answer properly. She held his gaze. Are you asking me to stay? He looked at her steadily. I'm saying the mountain is there. The cabin is there. There's enough land for a proper ranch if someone were inclined to work it. He paused. And I'm saying that I've spent 9 years being very certain that I was fine alone, and these 15 days have made me considerably less certain of that. It was she understood the most Nathan Walker would say directly. It was also she found enough. I need to see this through, she said. Caldwell's arrest, the federal case, the families who get their land back. I know it. That could take months. I know that too. You're willing to wait? He looked at her with the expression she had first seen across his kitchen table in the mountain cabin, when he had laid his brother's documents beside hers and seen the matching seals, and something in him had made a decision he hadn't yet spoken. Miss Bennett, he said, I waited 9 years on the wrong thing. I reckon I can wait a few months on the right one. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Eleanor. His expression shifted that small, almost invisible thing at the corners of his eyes that she had catalogued carefully over 15 days, because it was the rarest thing he produced, and therefore the most valuable. Eleanor, he said. The twist came at midnight. They had taken rooms at Cheyenne's only reputable boarding house, Eleanor in one, Nathan and Garrett in another, and Eleanor had fallen asleep faster than she'd expected, exhaustion finally winning the argument her mind had been making against it. She slept without dreaming, which was the sleep of someone whose body has finally been given permission to stop. Nathan woke her. He knocked twice quietly, and she was at the door in seconds. 15 days had wired her to surface fast from sleep, and he looked at her with the flat, focused expression that meant something had changed. Garrett got a response to the Denver wire, he said. She stepped back to let him in and lit the lamp. And, Whitfield, your father's lawyer. He's been trying to reach you for 3 weeks. Nathan looked at her carefully. The Federal Circuit in Denver opened an investigation into Continental Land and Settlement Company 6 weeks ago. Not based on your father's documents, based on a separate complaint filed by a railroad company whose survey crews kept finding discrepancies in Caldwell's patent boundaries. Eleanor stared at him. The Federal Circuit is already investigating. Yes. For 6 weeks. Yes. She sat down on the edge of the bed, not from weakness, but because her mind needed a moment to reconfigure everything she understood about the last 15 days. He knew, she said. Caldwell knew the Federal Circuit was looking at him. That's why he moved so fast on my father. That's why he sent men after me so quickly. It wasn't just about my father's documents. He needed to make certain nothing additional reached the federal investigation. I was already on fire, Nathan said. Your father's evidence was the accelerant. And now Briggs's certification goes to a circuit that is already building a case. She looked up at Nathan. This doesn't just end with Caldwell. This ends with Holloway and Morrison. The judges, the entire operation. Whitfield thinks so. Nathan sat down in the chair across from her. He also says, and this is the part that matters, that the railroad company's complaint included a list of properties where the boundary discrepancies were found. Eleanor knew what was coming before he said it. Bennett Ranch is on the list, Nathan said. Your father's land was already flagged in a federal survey as having a suspicious patent boundary 6 weeks ago. Before he died, before you ran. She looked at him. Your land was already being recovered, she said slowly. Through a different route. Before my father was killed. Yes. He didn't know. No. Nathan's voice was quiet. He didn't know the circuit had moved first. He thought he was the only person who had the evidence. He thought if he didn't get the documents out, the fraud would never come to light. She understood then fully, completely, the particular cruelty of it. Her father had died something that was already in motion. He had sacrificed himself to protect documents that were necessary and real and important, but he had not known that the ground had already begun to shift beneath Caldwell's feet through a completely separate fault line. He had not known. He had died not knowing that what he'd built was going to matter regardless. She sat with that for a long moment. She did not cry. She had said everything she had to say in tears on the third day of running, when she had been alone in the dark with nobody watching, and had finally let herself know what she had lost. She was past the crying. She was in whatever came after. The land, she said finally. Bennett Ranch. The federal survey flagging it as disputed means it was never legally transferred to Caldwell's company. The fraudulent patent is void. With Briggs's certification and the existing circuit investigation. Nathan paused. Whitfield thinks a federal judge could restore clear title within 60 days. Eleanor looked at this lamp. She looked at the shadows it threw. She thought about her father's hands on those documents by lamplight, the care of his handwriting the year he had spent building the case, and she thought he knew it was right. He knew the evidence was real. He went forward anyway, regardless of the cost, because it was right. He had not needed to know the outcome to do the right thing. She breathed out. 60 days, she said. Give or take. She looked at Nathan. You said the mountain, the cabin. Yes. Daniel's land is in that valley too. East of the mountain, you said. 15 miles. Nathan was very still. If the federal investigation corrects Caldwell's fraudulent patents across the board, she said carefully. Daniel's land might be recoverable too, if there's still a chain of title intact. Nathan said nothing. She watched him absorb the possibility, the way she had watched him absorb several things over 15 days carefully, without rushing, giving it room to be real before he responded to it. Whitfield would know, she said, if you wanted to ask. He looked at her for a long time. My brother worked that land for 4 years, he said. Built a house on it. I know. The house is probably gone. Houses can be rebuilt, she said. If the land is still there. Nathan looked at his hands. He looked at them the way a man looks at something he has been carrying for long enough that he has stopped noticing the weight, and then something shifts, and he feels it all at once. Write to Whitfield, he said. In the morning. I will, she said. Nathan. He looked up. Your brother's land, she said. Getting it back doesn't give you Daniel back. I know that. But it means the last thing they took from him doesn't stay theirs. Nathan was quiet for long enough that Eleanor thought she had said something wrong. Then he said in a voice that was very controlled and very quiet, No, it doesn't. He stood. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be full. He went to the door. Nathan, she said. He stopped. Thank you, she said, for not sending me away from your cabin. He was quiet for a moment, his hand on the doorframe. Then he said, Thank you for knocking. He closed the door quietly behind him. Chamta. Caldwell did not run that night. Sheriff Moss, whatever his complicated relationship with caution, had apparently found his spine when presented with a warrant signed by a territorial magistrate and the information that federal officers were already in motion from Denver. Caldwell was detained at the Grand Hotel at 2 in the morning, which Eleanor learned from Briggs's deputy, who came to the boarding house at first light with the news. She stood in the doorway of the boarding house and listened to the deputy explain it, and she felt something she had been too careful to feel for 15 days. The first small tentative loosening of the thing that had been wound tight in her chest since the morning she had arrived at her father's land, and found a stranger with a badge standing in her doorway. It wasn't over. There would be federal proceedings testimony, the slow machinery of law working through what Caldwell had spent years building. There would be lawyers and court dates, and the grinding patience of justice doing its work at justice's pace. But he was detained. In a room he couldn't walk out of, with federal officers coming. It had begun to end. Garrett found her an hour later in the dining room of the boarding house where she was eating the first real meal she had sat down to in 15 days, and eating it slowly, which was its own kind of victory. "Wire from Whitfield," Garrett said. He put the paper on the table beside her plate. She read it. Then she read it again. She looked up at Garrett. "He says Bennett Ranch title restoration is likely within 45 days, based on the existing federal survey flags." "Yes, ma'am." "And he says—" She looked at the paper once more. "He says Daniel Walker's original deed was registered in the Territorial Land Office and never formally transferred, only suppressed. It's still on the record." Garrett nodded. He said nothing. He was watching her with the look of a man who had known her father well enough to know what this news would mean and was giving her room to feel it. She set the wire down. She picked up her coffee cup. She thought about Nathan Walker on a mountain for 9 years, and she thought about the moment she had told him his brother's land might be recoverable, and the way his hands had looked when he absorbed it, and she thought about what it meant to be handed back something you had given up on. She thought about how her father would have felt about all of this, the federal case, the land restoration, the mountain cowboy who had seen her bleeding at his door and put the rifle down. She thought he would have been glad. She thought he would have said, "You see, Eleanor, some things take longer than we have, but they still arrive." She finished her coffee. She stood up from the table and folded the wire from Whitfield carefully and put it in her pocket, and she went to find Nathan Walker, because there was news that belonged to him, and she intended to be the one who gave it to him. How was outside as she had known he would be, already doing something useful, already in motion, because that was who he was. He had found a loose board on the boarding house porch steps and was fixing it with the particular focused competence of a man who could not be in a place without improving it slightly. She stood at the top of the steps and looked down at him. "I have news," she said. He looked up. He read her face. He had gotten good at that. Or perhaps he had always been good at it and had simply had nobody to practice on. Whatever he saw made him set the hammer down. She handed him the wire. She watched him read it. She watched Nathan Cole Walker, mountain cowboy, 9 years alone, the man who had carried his brother's death like a stone on a mountain road for nearly a decade, read the words that told him Daniel's land was still on the record, still registerable, still capable of being returned to the name it had always rightfully belonged to. He read it twice. He stood very still. Then he folded the wire with careful hands and held it. "Nathan," she said. He looked up at her. His face was what it always was, composed, controlled, the long-practiced stillness of a man who had made privacy a survival skill. But underneath it, in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw and the way his hands held that folded paper, she could see all the years it had cost him. "It's not finished," she said quietly. "The legal work, the filing, it'll take months." "I know," he said. "But it's on the record. His name is still on it." "Yes." His voice was very quiet. "It is." She let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, "I'm going to need somewhere to stay, while the restoration proceedings work through. I can't go back to Bennett Ranch until the title is clear, and I don't have the money for—" "The cabin's got a second room," Nathan said. She looked at him. "It's been used for storage," he said, "but it can be cleared." He looked back at the wire in his hands. "It's a fair ride from town. You'd need to learn the mountain trails properly, not just the main one." "You could teach me," she said. "I could," he agreed. She came down one step. "Nathan." He looked up at her. "We're going to get it back," she said. "His land. Your brother's land. I will personally ensure that Whitfield files every document necessary, and I will stand in that federal court myself if it requires a witness, and we will get it back." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she could feel the weight of 9 years in it, and the 15 days, and the morning he had put the rifle down, and every mile of road between the mountain cabin and this boarding house porch in Cheyenne. "I know you will," he said. He said it with the particular certainty of a man who had watched her do something impossible once already, and saw no reason to doubt she'd do it again. She held out her hand. He looked at it. Then he took it, and they shook the way two people shake hands on an agreement that means more than its terms, and she felt his grip steady, warm, the hands of a man who had been alone long enough to have forgotten how much weight a single human hand could hold when it was offered honestly. He didn't let go immediately. Neither did she. The federal marshals arrived in Cheyenne 2 days after the wire was sent, and they arrived the way federal authority tended to arrive when it had been waiting on something for a while, with the quiet, comprehensive efficiency of people who already knew most of the story and needed only the final pieces to complete it. There were 4 of them. The senior marshal was a woman named Deputy Marshal Clara Hines, which surprised everyone in Briggs's office, except Nathan, who had simply nodded when she walked in, as though competence in whatever form it arrived was something he'd long since stopped finding remarkable. Clara Hines was perhaps 40, with the economy of movement that came from years of doing serious work in conditions that didn't allow for excess, and she shook Eleanor's hand and looked at her for a long moment and said, "You're Thomas Bennett's daughter." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Your father sent a letter to our Denver office 14 months ago," Clara Hines said. "We were not fast enough." She said it without flinching from it. "I'm sorry for that." Eleanor looked at her. "Then help me make it mean something." "That's why we're here," Clara said. The proceedings that followed were not fast, but they were relentless, which was a different thing, and ultimately more valuable. Caldwell had lawyers, expensive ones, men, who had spent careers building delay into the architecture of legal process, and those lawyers worked hard in the first week to push the federal filing into procedural challenge, arguing jurisdiction, challenging the chain of evidence, custody, questioning the validity of Briggs's certification authority. Eleanor was present for every session. She sat in Briggs's outer office, or in the marshal's temporary headquarters at the hotel, and she read every document as it moved through the process, and she asked questions that the lawyers on both sides found either impressive or irritating, depending on which side they were on. Whitfield had arrived from Denver on the 3rd day and taken formal charge of the Bennett family's legal interest, but Eleanor worked alongside him in a way that made clear she was not a passive party to her own case. Nathan was there. Not in every meeting. He was not a man built for sitting in legal offices, but he was present in Cheyenne, and he was present for the moments that mattered, and Eleanor understood without it being stated that he was staying until she didn't need him to stay, and that she did not need to account for this or thank him for it. Garrett had ridden back to Colorado on the 4th day to begin the practical work of re-establishing Bennett Ranch's operational records, the livestock inventory, the water rights documentation, the employment records that would support the land title restoration. He left with a list from Eleanor that was 3 pages long, and he took it without complaint. "Your father would be using you well," Nathan said, watching Garrett ride out. "He trained me," Eleanor said. "I just finally have room to use it." Nathan looked at her. "You've always had room. You just didn't have ground under you." She thought about that for the rest of the day. The first major break came in the 2nd week, and it came from a direction none of them had anticipated. James Colt was alive. The wire came from Pueblo from Clara, his sister, and reached Deputy Marshal Hines on a Tuesday morning that Eleanor spent sitting with Whitfield, reviewing deposition schedules. Hines came into the room where they were working and set the wire on the table between them, and Eleanor read it again, and looked up. "He's been in Pueblo for 3 months, Hines said. He left Caldwell's surveying operation in April when he realized the documents he'd been asked to produce were being used for fraud. He took copies of his working maps before he left." She paused. "He has been too afraid to come forward because 2 men came to his sister's house in May asking for him." "Caldwell's men," Eleanor said. "Almost certainly." Hines looked at the wire. "He'll come forward now, with federal protection." Whitfield set his pen down and looked at Eleanor with the expression of a lawyer who has just watched an already strong case become airtight. A first-hand witness who participated in the surveying process, who can testify to the deliberate falsification of the patent maps, who has his own copies of the original working documents. He stopped. He almost smiled. Miss Bennett, your father built a better case than he knew. Eleanor looked at the wire. She thought about James Colt in Pueblo for 3 months, frightened and unable to move, carrying his own piece of the evidence in isolation. She thought about the way her father had built things piece by piece, person by person, each one holding only their own part, so that no single capture could unravel the whole. He knew exactly what he was building, she said quietly. He just didn't know all the pieces were still in place. Colt arrived in Cheyenne 9 days later under federal escort. A thin man in his mid-30s, with the particular tension of someone who had been afraid for a long time and was slowly, cautiously beginning to believe it might be safe to stop. He met Eleanor in Briggs' office with his hat in his hands, and he said, "Miss Bennett, I'm sorry I couldn't come forward sooner. I'm sorry I wasn't braver." "You came forward when you could," Eleanor said. "That's enough. It's not enough for what happened to your father." "Mr. Colt." She held his gaze. "You fed information to Harold Fitch for 4 months at personal risk. You made copies of your working maps before you left. You survived." She paused. "I need your testimony, not your guilt. Save the guilt for after the verdict." He blinked. Then something in his posture changed, the slight unburdening of a person who has been given permission to put something down. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Nathan, who had been standing near the door, caught Eleanor's eye across the room. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The legal proceedings ground forward. Caldwell's lawyers filed 3 separate challenges in the first 3 weeks. 2 were dismissed outright by the federal circuit judge who had come up from Denver, a spare, precise man named Judge Callahan, who had the look of someone who had seen every procedural delay tactic that existed and was bored by all of them. The third challenge required a formal response from Whitfield, which took 4 days and produced 40 pages that Eleanor read in their entirety. She was sitting in this hotel dining room with the last 10 pages of Whitfield's response when Nathan sat down across from her without announcement, which was his established approach to most things, and put a cup of coffee in front of her. "You've been at that for 6 hours, he said. "I'm almost done. The lawyers are handling it." "I know they are." She turned a page. "I'm handling it too." He watched her for a moment. "You don't trust anyone to do it without you." She looked up. "That's not it." "What is it?" She was quiet for a moment, deciding whether to say the true thing. She had found over the weeks in Cheyenne that she was increasingly inclined to say the true thing to Nathan Walker, possibly because he always said the true thing back, and it had become a kind of reciprocal honesty that she valued more than she'd expected to. "My father did everything right," she said. "He was meticulous and careful, and he trusted the right people, and he built something real, and he still died for it." She looked at the papers. "So I read everything myself. Because careful and meticulous and trusting the right people is not always enough. And if something goes wrong in those pages, I want to be the one who caught it. Not because I don't trust Whitfield. Because I don't trust the world to be fair just because we've done everything right." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "That's not a wrong way to think," he said. "I know it isn't. But you're going to have to learn to sleep eventually." She looked at him. Something about the way he said it, not a reprimand, not worry exactly, just the plain observation of a man paying attention, made her set the papers down. "When this is done," she said. "When is done?" She thought about it honestly. "When the verdict comes. When the land is formally restored. When Caldwell is sentenced and the other families have their titles back." She paused. "When Daniel's land is filed." Nathan looked at the table. He had received a wire from Whitfield 3 days ago about the Daniel Walker land filing. She had been standing next to him when he read it. The deed was valid. The filing was processing. It would take another 30 days, but the outcome was not in doubt. He had read the wire twice and handed it back to her and said, "Good." And that had been all he'd said about it. She had let him have that. She had learned that Nathan Walker processed things of great personal weight by saying very little and being very useful to other people for a period of time afterward, and that this was not absence, but presence in a different form. 30 days, he said now. "Give or take," she said. "That's your done." Yes. He looked at her. Then I'll remind you about sleeping again in 30 days. She picked the papers back up, but she found she was reading slightly less tensely than she had been before. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived on the 22nd day of Caldwell's federal detention, and it arrived in the form of a name that Eleanor had not heard before spoken in a wire from Deputy Marshal Hines that reached them at 7 in the morning when Eleanor and Nathan were both in the hotel dining room and Hines walked in with it herself, rather than sending it by messenger, which told Eleanor before she read a word that it was something significant. She read it. She looked it up at Hines. Judge Holloway. He's been cooperating, Hines said. For the past week, quietly. She sat down at the table without being invited. His lawyers approached the federal circuit 6 days ago with an offer full testimony about the arrangement with Caldwell, the specific mechanism of the patent fraud, the names of the land office clerks who processed the false filings in exchange for sentencing consideration. Nathan said, Morrison, not yet. But if Holloway is testifying, Morrison's lawyers will be making the same call within the week. Hines looked at Eleanor. Miss Bennett, if both judges testify against Caldwell under oath, the federal case doesn't just convict Caldwell, it dismantles the entire structure. Every fraudulent patent, every corrupted land clerk, every family that lost property in the 6-year operation. Eleanor sat very still. All 11 families. All of them. And any others that come forward during proceedings. She looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at Eleanor. Between them across the table was the particular weight of something that was becoming more real than they had allowed themselves to believe it would fully become. My father knew Holloway was involved, Eleanor said slowly. He had the letter, but he never believed Holloway would break. Caldwell apparently promised Holloway a great deal, Hines said, and is now in a position to deliver none of it. That changes a man's calculations. When does Holloway testify? Next week. The formal federal hearing has been set. Hines looked at her carefully. You'll be asked to testify as well. You and Colt both. Eleanor had expected this. She had been expecting it for 3 weeks. She had been preparing for it in the quiet hours when the legal documents were finished and Nathan was asleep. And she sat with what she was going to say about her father, and the documents, and the 15 days, and all that had come before. I'll be ready, she said. She was ready. She sat in the federal courtroom in Denver. They had moved the proceedings there for the formal hearing, which required a full federal bench, and she sat across a room from Gerald Caldwell, who had been brought in under federal escort, and looked considerably diminished from the man who had walked into Briggs's office and smiled at her with the confidence of someone who had never lost a room. He had lost several rooms since then. He looked like a man who had recently understood what it felt like. Nathan was in the gallery. She had told him he didn't need to come to Denver. The legal proceedings didn't require him, and he had looked at her the way he looked at things. He found mildly unreasonable, and had not dignified the suggestion with a verbal response. He had simply saddled a horse and come. She was glad he was there. She did not turn to look at him because she needed to keep her attention forward, but she knew exactly where he was sitting, and it made a difference in her breathing that she was not inclined to analyze too carefully. She gave her testimony over the course of 3 hours. She was clear and precise, and she said the true thing at every point, which was the only approach she had ever had, and which served her extremely well in a federal courtroom. She answered every question from Caldwell's lawyers, without flinching, because they had nothing. They had no way to challenge the physical documents, or the surveyor's testimony, or the judge's cooperation, and the questions they asked were the questions of people who knew they were losing, and were going through the motions of not losing anyway. When she was done, Judge Callahan thanked her for her testimony, and she stood and walked back to her seat, and she did not look at Caldwell as she passed him. She didn't need to. James Colt testified the following morning. He was precise and technical and thorough, and he brought his own copies of the working maps that showed in clear surveying notation exactly where the patent boundaries had been falsified and how, and by the time he was done, even Caldwell's lawyers had stopped taking notes. Holloway testified in the afternoon. He was 61 years old, and he had the look of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had decided at the end that putting it down was worth whatever it cost him. He testified for 4 hours. He named names, dates, amounts paid, instructions given. He confirmed every piece of Eleanor's documentary evidence from the inside. By the time the formal arguments were complete, the outcome was not a question. The question was only the scope of the consequences. The verdict came on a Thursday morning, and it was comprehensive. Gerald Caldwell was found guilty on 14 federal counts, including land fraud conspiracy to obstruct federal land review, corruption of territorial judicial officers, and 2 counts of conspiracy connected to the deaths of Thomas Bennett and James Colt's professional associate. The sentencing would come later, but the minimum on the combined counts was 20 years in federal prison, and Caldwell's lawyers had stopped arguing minimums. Both territorial judges were removed from the bench and faced separate proceedings. The land office clerks, who had processed the fraudulent filings, were identified and referred for prosecution. The Continental Land and Settlement Company's assets were frozen pending federal review of all patents filed over the 6-year operation. 11 families were formally notified that their land title restorations were being processed. Eleanor was standing outside the courthouse with Nathan when Whitfield came out with the written verdict in his hand and read the key findings aloud in the precise, contained voice of a lawyer who had done this a long time and had learned not to celebrate things that were serious. When he finished, he looked up at Eleanor and said, "Your father's case, Miss Bennett, complete." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the street in front of the courthouse, and she thought about Thomas Bennett at his kitchen table by lamplight, and she thought about what he would have said standing here with the verdict in hand. She thought he would have said very little, actually. He would have nodded once the way he nodded when something long and hard was completed, and then he would have said, "Now what's next?" because he was always already moving toward the next right thing. She thought, that is where I get it from. "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield," she said. "Send me the restoration timeline for Bennett Ranch as soon as you have it." 40 days, Whitfield said. "Perhaps 35. "Good." She shook his hand. "And Daniel Walker's filing? 28 days. It's straightforward. At this point, the deed is clean. The fraud is adjudicated. The restoration is procedural." Whitfield looked at Nathan. "Mr. Walker, your brother's land will be formally returned to the Walker estate within the month. I'm sorry it took this long." Nathan looked at him. "Thank you," he said. 2 words plainly spoken and a handshake. That was all. He gave it out there on the street, and Eleanor understood that whatever he would give to it later would happen somewhere private, as was his way. Whitfield left. Garrett, who had come up from Colorado for the verdict, said he was going back south to begin the practical work at Bennett Ranch. He shook Eleanor's hand, and then Nathan's, and then he said to Eleanor quietly, "He would have been proud enough to burst, Miss Eleanor. Your father. He would have been proud enough that he'd have had trouble showing it properly." "I know," she said. "He was never very good at showing it." "No," Garrett said. "But he felt it." He looked at her steadily. "He felt everything about you. He told me once, I don't know that he'd want me repeating it, but he said you were the clearest thinker he'd ever known. He said he wished he'd told you that directly." She looked at Garrett. Her throat closed briefly, cleanly, and she let it. "He showed me," she said. "In his own way. He showed me." Garrett nodded. He tipped his hat and left. The ride back towards the mountain took 3 days, and they rode it at a different pace than they had ridden anything over the past 6 weeks. Not urgently, not with one eye behind them, not with the arithmetic of hours running in Eleanor's head. They rode at the pace of people who had somewhere to be and were not being chased away from anywhere. The second day, in the middle of the afternoon, Nathan said out of a comfortable silence, "Tell me something." "What?" "When you knocked on my door, that first night." He looked ahead at the trail. "Were you actually as calm as you seemed, or were you terrified?" She thought about it. "Both," she said. "I was terrified underneath, and I had decided that showing it wasn't going to help either of us, so I kept it under." "You were good at that." "I'd been practicing for 15 days. He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't as calm as I seemed either," he said. "When I put the rifle down." She looked at him. "You seemed very calm." "I know." He looked at the trail. I was working hard at it. What were you working against? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to redirect. Then he said, I'd been alone for 9 years, and you knocked on my door bleeding and stood up when your knees went wrong and didn't ask me for anything except not to shoot you. He paused. I wasn't prepared for that. Eleanor looked at him. You put the rifle down, she said. Whatever you were feeling, you put the rifle down. Yes. That's the part that matters. He turned and looked at her fully. Not the sideways glances she'd grown accustomed to, but directly. I've been thinking, he said, about what you said in Cheyenne, about not knowing who you were when you weren't fighting. I remember. I've been the same, he said. For 9 years. I've known who I was on the mountain, the man who fixed the fence and watered the horses and kept the cabin, and didn't have anything to lose because he'd stopped having anything to care about. He held her gaze. I don't want to be that man anymore. You haven't been that man since you put the rifle down, she said. No. He agreed. I stopped being him when a woman knocked on my door and I couldn't make myself send her away. They rode for a while in the particular silence that had its own texture. Now not the silence of two strangers who had nothing to say to each other, but the silence of two people who had said enough of the necessary things and were comfortable in what remained. The second room, Eleanor said. At the cabin. It's being cleared, he said. I started before we left. She looked at him. You cleared the storage room before we even left for Cheyenne. I was planning ahead. That was very presumptuous of you, Nathan Walker. The corners of his eyes moved. It was practical, he said. There's a difference. I'm sure there is. You were going to need somewhere to stay while the land restoration processed. 35 days, she said. Yes. And after 35 days, when Bennett Ranch has a clear title, then you'll have a choice to make, he said, about where you want to be. She looked at him. Will you come with me to see it? He looked at her. To Bennett Ranch. When it's restored, will you come with me to see it? She held his gaze. I've been thinking about rebuilding it properly. The house needs work. The fences need resetting. The cattle inventory needs to start over. She paused. I could use someone who knows how to fix a fence, and water horses, and read the weather. He looked at her for a long moment. His face did what it did, the careful, controlled composure that she had spent 6 weeks learning to read underneath. I reckon I could look at it, he said. Just look at it. To start. She smiled fully for what felt like the first time in a long time. A real smile that didn't have reservation or strategy in it. He saw it. She could tell he saw it by the way something settled in his expression, the way a man looks when something uncertain becomes certain. To start, she agreed. They reached the mountain on the afternoon of the third day, and Nathan's cabin sat where it had sat since he'd built it against the mountain's face timber. Dark, the summer light long and golden across the grass in front of it. Eleanor stood at the edge of the property and looked at it. She had last seen it in the dark, running with men behind her and a bleeding arm, and nothing but the envelope and the distance she could cover before daylight. She looked at it now in full summer afternoon, and it looked different. Not smaller, not less. It looked like what it was, a place a man had built with his hands, and kept with his hands, and lived in alone for 9 years, because it was the only thing he had left that was wholly his. She thought about what it took to keep a thing like that alive. She thought about what it took to open the door. Nathan came to stand beside her. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the fence line he'd fixed the morning after she arrived, when she'd brought him coffee without being asked, and they'd stood in the early light, and he'd begun asking questions that changed everything. It's been empty for 6 weeks, he said. I can tell, she said. The fence on the east side needs attention. He looked at it. Yes, it does. I can help with that, she said. He looked at her. Can you? I can learn. She looked at him. You said you could teach me the mountain trails. I did say that. You said the mare was steady. She is. Then I have a horse and a willingness to learn, and approximately 35 days before my land has a clear title. She held his gaze. That seems like enough time to learn something worth knowing. Nathan looked at her for the long, steady moment that she had come to understand meant he was making a decision that went deeper than whatever words he was about to use. "We should get the horses settled," he said, "and check what needs doing in the cabin." "Yes," she said, "we should." They walked in. The restoration paper for Bennett Ranch arrived in 33 days. Eleanor was on the east fence line when Nathan came out with the wire, which had been delivered to the nearest town and brought up by a rider he'd arranged to receive his correspondence. She read it standing at the fence with her work gloves still on and the wire in both hands and the mountain summer air clean and warm around her. Clear title: Bennett Ranch. Eleanor Grace Bennett sole heir. Effective immediately. She folded the wire carefully. She put it in her pocket. She picked up the fence post she'd been working with and settled it back into position and tamped it down and looked at the line of it. "Good," Nathan said. "Good," she said. He handed her the mallet. She drove the post the rest of the way in. They went back to work. 3 days later, a second wire came. This one Nathan received himself, and he came to find her in the kitchen where she was making coffee. She had taken over coffee making in the 3rd week because Nathan's coffee was technically functional but lacked ambition, which she'd told him directly, and which had produced the almost smile, and he handed her the wire without speaking. Daniel Walker. Original deed. Restored. Walker estate effective from date of original fraudulent suppression. She read it. She looked up. Nathan was standing at the kitchen door, and he was doing the thing he did with serious things, holding them quietly, processing in the privacy of his own careful interior, not rushing toward whatever it was going to cost him to feel this fully. She put the wire on the table. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him. "Nathan," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were entirely steady and entirely human, and she could see all of it 9 years, and Daniel and the mountain and the rifle he'd put down, and everything that had come after. "He gets to have it back," she said. "Even now, even this way. His name is on it, and it's his, and nobody can take it again." Nathan breathed in once slowly. "Yes," he said. "It is. That matters." "Yes," he said again quieter. "It does." She reached up and put her hand on his arm briefly, simply the way you touched someone who needed to know they were not alone with something too large to hold entirely by themselves. He looked down at her hand. Then he put his own hand over it. They stood like that for a moment. Then he said, "There's a fence on the south side that needs the same attention as the east." "I know," she said. "I noticed it yesterday. You could start on it this afternoon." "I was planning to." He looked at her. Something in his face was different from the way it had been 6 weeks ago, or even 3 weeks ago. Quieter, but in a different way. Not the quiet of careful guardedness, but the quiet of a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying so long, he'd forgotten the weight of it, and was finding out what it felt like to stand without it. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up at him. "I'm glad you knocked," he said. "I know I've said it before. I wanted to say it again." She held his gaze. "I'm glad you put the rifle down," she said. "I know I've said that before too." He almost smiled. "We're going to have to find new things to say eventually." "I expect we'll have time," she said. He looked at her. Warm, the same eyes that had read her across a rifle barrel on the first night, and seen not a problem to be handled, but a person who needed not to be sent away. "I expect we will," he said. In the end, there are people who spend their lives waiting to be rescued, and there are people who spend their lives building the thing that makes rescue unnecessary. Thomas Bennett had been the second kind, and he had raised a daughter who was the second kind, and he had died not knowing whether what he'd built would hold. It held. Eleanor Grace Bennett rebuilt Bennett Ranch in the months that followed, and she did it with the same methodical attention her father had brought to everything he valued. Fence by fence, herd by herd. The slow and unglamorous work of restoring something good to what it should have been. Garrett came back and stayed. Ruth Calloway visited twice and stayed the second time long enough to help replant the kitchen garden. Harold Fitch ran 3 more stories in the Cheyenne Register about the land restoration proceedings, As the other families received their titles back, and the stories were read across the territory and beyond it, which was what her father had always believed the truth was capable of doing when someone was willing to carry it far enough. Nathan came to Bennett Ranch the first time in late summer. He came to help with the south fence line and stayed 3 days. He came a second time in early fall. He came a third time and didn't say how long he was staying, and Eleanor didn't ask because she had learned that some things with Nathan Walker operated best without timelines. He fixed the south fence. He rehung the barn door that had warped. He taught her 3 mountain tracking skills in the field north of the property on a morning when the air was beginning to carry the first edge of autumn, and she was a better student than he'd expected, and a worse one than she claimed to be, and neither of them told the other which was which. Daniel Walker's land was formally transferred back to the Walker estate in mid-October. Nathan rode out to it on a Tuesday morning alone. Eleanor did not ask to come with him. She understood without explanation that this was something he needed to do privately, the way certain things needed to be done in front of no one. A conversation you could only have with a person who was no longer there in a place that had belonged to them, where the land itself was the only witness. Howe was gone for most of the day. He came back in the early evening, and Eleanor was on the porch of the ranch house when he rode up, and he dismounted and stood with his horse for a moment, and she waited and did not ask. Then he said, "The house is gone, collapsed years ago, but the foundation's still there." "Yes," she said. "It was a good piece of land." His voice was steady. "He had a good eye for it." "He had a good teacher," she said. "I expect." Nathan looked at her. "I'm going to rebuild it," he said. "The house, on the original foundation." "I know," she said. He tilted his head slightly. "You know." "I've known since Cheyenne," she said. "When I told you the land might be recoverable. I saw it in your face that you were going to rebuild it. You just needed time to get there." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to need help," he said. "It's not a one-man job." She looked at him. "Are you asking me for help, Nathan Walker?" "I'm asking if you'd be willing to consult," he said, with the careful precision of a man who had spent his life being self-sufficient, and was learning slowly that asking was not a lesser thing than doing alone. "On the construction, the land, he paused, "the general shape of things." She stood and came down off the porch. She stopped in front of him. "I'll do better than consult," she said. He looked at her for the long, steady moment that she had catalogued as the signal for a decision being made that mattered. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes." "I haven't done this well," he said. "Being around people, trusting, any of it. I'm out of practice in ways I can't fully account for yet." "I know," she said. "I'm going to make mistakes." "I expect so," she said. "So will I. He stopped. He started again. "I spent 9 years on that mountain convinced that what I had was enough, that the alone was enough." He looked at her directly. "It wasn't. I just didn't have anything to measure it against until you knocked on my door." She held his gaze. "You put the rifle down," she said. "The moment you saw I was bleeding, before you knew anything about me. You saw a person who needed help, and you put the rifle down." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw briefly, the way you touched someone when words were close to the limit of what they could carry. "That's who you've always been, Nathan. The mountain just kept you from anyone who could see it." He covered her hand with his. He held it there for a moment. Then he said, "I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing." She looked at him, this man who had aimed a rifle at her and put it down, who had ridden 3 days to Cheyenne without being asked who had put his hand over hers in a kitchen doorway, when the wire told him his brother's land was his again, who had fixed every fence he'd encountered and taught her to drive a post and read weather and trust the mountain in summer. "I'm willing," she said. He nodded once. He looked at her hand. He looked at her. "Good," he said. That was Nathan Walker, and it was enough, and she had always known since the dark cabin and the rifle coming down, and the 5 minutes before you collapse. That enough from him was more than plenty from anyone else. She took her hand back. She looked at the ranch house behind her solid and repaired, and hers, and she looked at the mountains ahead, where Daniel Walker's land waited, and a foundation that had held through years of neglect was ready to hold something new. She thought about her father. She thought about what he had said to Garrett. She's going to need someone who knows her face when she gets there. She thought that Thomas Bennett, who had known her better than anyone, had understood something she hadn't known yet that she would need. Not just someone who recognized her, but someone who saw her truly, clearly, entirely, and chose to stay. She had run 15 days through mountain country and summer heat, with men behind her, and a wound on her arm, and everything gone. She had arrived. She was still standing. And standing beside her, quiet as mountain weather and twice as reliable, was the man who had seen her stumble and never once suggested she fall. Some people come into your life when you are at your lowest so they can watch you rise. Nathan Cole Walker had done something rarer than that. He had stood at the bottom with her and risen alongside her, and neither of them had done it for the other. They had done it because it was right, and because it was time, and because sometimes the person who changes everything about your life is not the one who rescues you from the storm. They are the one who says, "I see the storm. I'm not leaving. Let's walk."